Hey guys, welcome back to Reading with RaRa. Tonight we are going to start something a little bit different. It's going to be maybe more for a little bit of older kids. It's going to be a chapter book that my nephews introduced me to. The Adventures of Captain Underpants. So hopefully you enjoy it just as much as they have, and so far it's been pretty funny. But tonight we're going to do the first couple chapters, and there are some pictures in here, so I'll show them as well, but here we go. Chapter 1, George and Harold. Meet George Beard and Harold Hutchins. George is the kid on the left with the tie and the flat top. Harold is the one on the right with the t-shirt and the bad haircut. Remember that now. George and Harold were best friends. They had a lot in common. They lived right next door to each other, and they were both in the same 4th grade class at Jerome Horwitz Elementary School. George and Harold were usually responsible kids. Whenever anything bad happened, George and Harold were usually responsible. But don't get the wrong idea about these two. George and Harold were actually very nice boys. No matter what everybody else thought, they were good, sweet, and lovable. Well, okay, maybe they weren't so sweet and lovable, but they were good nonetheless. It's just that George and Harold usually had a silly streak, a mile long. Usually that silly streak was hard to control. Sometimes it got them into trouble, and once it got them into big, big trouble. But before I can tell you that story, I have to tell you this story. Chapter 2, Treehouse Comics, Inc. After a hard day of cracking jokes, pulling pranks, and causing mayhem at school, George and Harold liked to rush to the old treehouse in George's backyard. Inside the treehouse were 2 big, old, fluffy chairs, a table, a cupboard crammed with junk food, and a padlocked crate filled with pencils, pens, and stacks of paper. Now, Harold loved to draw, and George loved to make up stories. And together, the 2 boys spent hours and hours writing and drawing their very own comic books. Over the years, they had created hundreds of their own comics, starring dozens of their own superheroes. First, there was Dogman. Then came Timmy the Talking Toilet. And who could forget the amazing Cow Lady? But the all-time greatest superhero they ever made up had to be the amazing Captain Underpants. George came up with the idea. Most superheroes look like they're flying around in their underwear, he said. Well, this guy actually is flying around in his underwear. The 2 boys laughed and laughed. Hey, yeah, said Harold. He could fight with wedgie power! George and Harold spent entire afternoons writing and drawing the comic adventures of Captain Underpants. He was their coolest superhero ever. Luckily for the boys, the secretary at Jerome Horwitz Elementary School was much too busy to keep an eye on the copy machine. So whenever they got a chance, Harold and George would sneak into the office and run off several hundred copies of their latest Captain Underpants adventure. After school, they sold their homemade comics on the playground for 50 cents each. Chapter 3, The Adventures of Captain Underpants, written by George Beard, cartoons by Harold Hutchins. The Really Cool Adventures of Captain Underpants. It was the time of darkness and despair for planet Earth. Bad guys had taken over the streets, and all of the superheroes in the world were too old to fight the evil. Then along came a new, improved, extra-strength superhero. Tra-la-la! Look up in the sky! It's a bird! It's a plane! It's an egg salad sandwich! No way! I'm Captain Underpants! Captain Underpants was faster than a speeding waistband, more powerful than boxer shorts, and able to leap tall buildings without getting a wedgie. Tra-la-la! Night and day, Captain Underpants watched over the city, fighting for truth, justice, and all that is pre-shrunk and cottony. Meanwhile, at a nearby elementary school, it was Stinky Taco Surprise Day at the cafeteria. Yuck! Everybody hated it so much they threw it away. Soon, the cafeteria food came to life. I am the inedible hunk! The monster ran around the school, eating everything in sight. Help! The inedible hunk just ate up 15 folding chairs and the gym teacher. Oh no, not folding chairs, said the principal. This looks like a job for Captain Underpants. Tra-la-la. Captain Underpants shot lots of underwear at the monster, but it didn't do any good. So Captain Underpants took off running. The inedible hunk chased after him. Grrr, said the inedible hunk. Help! Yelled Captain Underpants. The inedible hunk chased him, and finally the inedible hunk got too tired and thirsty to chase Captain Underpants. How about a nice drink of water? So the monster took a long drink from a shiny white bowl. Gulp, gulp, gulp. When suddenly, flush! Hooray for Captain Underpants! And so the inedible hunk got flushed away and was never heard from again. Tra-la-la! The end. Don't miss our next adventure. Captain Underpants in the Attack of the Talking Toilets, coming soon to a playground near you. Chapter 4. Mean Old Mr. Krupp. Do you see the old guy looking out the window up there? That's Mr. Krupp, the principal. Now, Mr. Krupp was the meanest, sourest old principal in the whole history of Jerome Horowitz Elementary School. He hated laughter and singing. He hated the sounds of children playing at recess. In fact, he hated children altogether. And guess which two children Mr. Krupp hated most of all? If you guessed George and Harold, you're right. Mr. Krupp hated George and Harold. He hated their pranks and their wisecracks. He hated their silly attitudes and their constant giggling. And he especially hated those awful Captain Underpants comic books. I'm going to get those boys one day, Mr. Krupp vowed. One day, very, very soon. Chapter 5. One day, very, very soon. Remember when I said that George and Harold's silly streak got them into big trouble once? Well, This is the story of how that happened, and how some huge pranks and a little blackmail turned their principal into the coolest superhero of all time. It was the day of the big football game between Horowitz Knuckleheads and the Steubenville Stinkbugs. The bleachers were filled with fans. The cheerleaders ran onto the field and shook their pom-poms over their head. A fine black dust drifted out of their pom-poms and settled all around them. "Give me a K!" shouted the cheerleaders. "K!" repeated the fans. "Give me an N!" shouted the cheerleaders. "N!" repeated the fans. "Give me an achoo!" sneezed the cheerleaders. Achoo! repeated the fans. The cheerleader sneezed and sneezed and sneezed some more. They couldn't stop sneezing. "Hey," shouted a fan in the bleachers, "somebody sprinkled black pepper into the cheerleaders' pom-poms." "I wonder who did that," said another fan. The cheerleaders stumbled off the field, sneezing and dripping with mucus, as the marching band members took their places. But when the band began to play, steady streams of bubbles began blowing out of their instruments. Bubbles were everywhere, up and down the field. The marching band slipped and slid, leaving behind a thick trail of wet, bubbly foam. "Hey!" shouted a fan in the bleachers. "Somebody poured bubble bath into the marching band's instruments." "I wonder who did that?" asked another fan. Soon the football teams took the field. The knuckleheads kicked the ball. Up went the ball. Higher and higher it went. The ball sailed into the clouds and kept right on going until nobody could see it anymore. "Hey!" shouted a fan in the bleachers. "Somebody filled the game ball with helium." "I wonder who did that?" asked another fan. But the missing ball didn't make any difference, because at that moment, the knuckleheads were rolling around the field, scratching and itching like crazy. "Hey!" shouted the coach. "Somebody replaced our deep-heating muscle rub lotion with Mr. Prankster's extra scratchy itching cream." "We wonder who did that?" shouted the fans in the bleachers. The whole afternoon went on much the same way, with people shouting from, "Hey, somebody put sea monkeys in the lemonade," to, "Hey, somebody glued all the bathroom doors shut." Before long, most of the fans in the bleachers had gotten up and left. The big game had been forfeited, and everyone in the entire school was miserable. Everyone, that is, except for two giggling boys crouching in the shadows beneath the bleachers. "Those were our best pranks yet," laughed Harold. "Yep," chuckled George. "They'll be hard to top, that's for sure." "I just hope we don't get busted for this," said Harold. "Don't worry," said George. "We covered our tracks really well. There's no way we'll get busted." All right, guys, tune in tomorrow for a couple more chapters to see what happens.